inviting me. I don't know all of you. I know some of you, which is nice. I'm Kariem. I'm a consultant at Guys and Tommies, and I'm the Trust R&D lead for Theatre's Anaesthesia Peri-operative Medicine Directorate Research Lead, editor for Anaesthesia, editor for Anaesthesia Reports. This is my Twitter handle. I can't remember what that QR code does, but I don't think it does anything dangerous. I think it just takes you to my Twitter page. This is where I work, which I'm sure some of you know, right across the river from the circus. And as I said, editor for these two journals, and irrelevant conflicts of interest really for this. And I thought that I could talk to you guys a little bit about some things that perhaps a few years ago I didn't really understand so much. And I kind of wish someone would have sat me down and tried to explain some of these things to me, which is these three elements, which is how journals work, a little bit about publication models, and then a little bit about choosing the right journal. Okay, so these are three key things that I don't think that we're taught very well, and I'm hoping to just go through a little bit with you guys casually, without being too didactic. And I just want you to remember, a lot of what I'm saying here is a little bit of my opinion. Nothing is hard and fast. And I'm entitled to my opinions, contrary to what publishers will say to you. So how journals work. Let's start with this, because this is actually quite important. It helps you understand the principles of academic publishing. So there's a few key stakeholders here. There's the author, which is usually most of you guys, who are the people that do all the hard work, who conduct the research, okay? And then there's the editorial team. And the editorial team, I say the team because it is a team. Which includes the editor-in-chief. It includes all of the editors. Different journals have different formats. Some have executive section editors. The ANA have about 850 trillion members of the editorial team. It's preposterous, if you ask me. And of course, some of the most crucial participants of the editorial team are the editorial coordinators and the administration team, without which no journals would be able to actually manage, because you'd be leaving the coordination side of things to the editors, who can't really even coordinate SOCs. But the point of the editorial team is to conduct and manage the whole peer review process, assess scientific quality, get messages out from the science that has come in, and be able to edit it and present it in a way that is useful for the end user. Okay, so our job is to conduct the peer review process to, filter out the matter that is useful for our readers and to present it in such a way. Then there's the publishers. Okay, so the publisher's job here is to copy, edit, typeset, print, and distribute and market. And I'll go through at what point they get involved later. And then of course there's the institutions. So for anesthesia, the institution is the Association of Anaesthetists. So what the association do, we are the journal of the association. For BJA, they are the journal of the Royal College. So these societies or institutions have to prioritize their membership and make sure that the journals that they are putting out are reflecting and supporting what their membership would want, hope, and expect. And then, of course, there's the reader. Okay, so this is often people forget about this, but the reader is actually one of the most important participants in the whole process, because they're the ones that actually implement the research. They're the ones that actually kind of matter. It's all well and good doing research, but as they say, the vast majority of research is read by the author and the editor and no one else. But what you really want is the participation of the reader. And this is a little bit of the flow of how things go. So the author will submit things to the editorial team. The editorial team will work on the peer review process. If that paper is accepted, they will edit it, sub-edit it, prepare it, and send it to the publisher. And then the publisher will package it nicely, beautifully, and send it to the reader. The institution, in reality, has very little day-to-day involvement. So the college have very little day-to-day involvement in the running of the BJA, although they do determine the editorial team, they do determine the publisher, and they do work very closely on strategy. But day-to-day running doesn't fall to the institution. In fact, day-to-day running falls to external reviewers sometimes. Now, there's different formats by which journals can undertake a peer review process. And there's two key ways. Firstly, peer review can primarily be conducted internally, so within that editorial team. Or secondly, peer review can be conducted externally, so you send it to external reviewers. And you know, different journals choose different models, and there's obviously hybrid models. So internal peer review, how it works. The author submits to the editorial team. The editor-in-chief reviews every paper. This is certainly how it works with anesthesia. The editor-in-chief reviews absolutely every single paper, makes a decision, accept, reject. Well, it's never a final accept. Usually a provisional accept, reject, or not sure. The editor-in-chief then sends that to an appropriate editor. And so say Andy will send me, I used to get all of the airway and all of the regional stuff until we got some new editors on board, because I was the only person that was doing airway and regional. So Andy would see a paper, he'd say, this is great, Kariem, what do you think? And I'd say, this is great. We both agree, then I will sub-edit and I will handle that paper. Andy says, this is great. I look at it and I say, this is crap. I either send to someone external or I send to another member of our editorial team for a second or third opinion. Sometimes we're really unsure and we get all of the editors. So 14 of us review a paper when we're not sure. And sometimes the subject matter is out with the scope of what each of us knows in detail. So we'll send it to someone external to get that feedback. But in general, if one can manage it all internally, then that's great. So we do manage it internally. And I think that's the way that we run at anesthesia. And I think that's a really nice way of doing it for several reasons. Firstly, it's super quick. Now we say at least 80% of submissions have a response within 2 weeks. Okay, so an initial response within 2 weeks of submission, which I think is actually really good. Of course, there are fast track papers. So during COVID, we basically upregulated the internal peer review process, and we had to come up with a decision within 24 hours of submission. And in fact, sometimes we had to sub-edit papers and have them submitted to the publisher within 48 hours of submission. So that was pretty hard. But we have that gives us the speed and the agility. And personally, I think that actually reduces the effects of bias in peer review. So the alternative model is going to be author submits to the journal, and then journal relies primarily on external reviewers. And this is one of the more common models. So it'll come to me as the editor, and I'll say, okay, this is a paper on on this particular block, for example. So my job is I need to get a peer review of this done. So I will send it to Professor X in California, and I will send it to Professor Y in Melbourne, for example. I'll say, can I get your peer-reviewed opinion on this? And I choose them because they're subject matter experts in this. So they know about this particular block technique. So I send it to them for their peer review. Of course, what that relies on them having the time. So it adds tremendous amount of time sometimes. It's burdensome for them. And I think we all know that peer review is, the leave guy is just outside right now. But I think we all know that the peer review process is a little bit of charity work on our part. Because whenever I review for other journals, I'm doing it for literally nothing. You know, I spend time. A thorough peer review takes time, and we're doing it for very little recompense. So we send it for someone externally. Now, the reason why I say slow is because it takes time. The other reason is bias. So an example is I send it to Professor X and Professor Y, who are subject matter experts in this particular block, but they're not involved in this study and they have particular views on this block. Well, actually, their opinions will be valid, of course, because they're their opinions, but there will be a conflict of interest here because they may not, approve, appreciate, or be particularly supportive of this of this interpretation of this block technique or whatever it is. So therefore, there's an element of bias in the peer review process. The other problem that I think with the peer review process is blinding. So it's always single blind. The poor author knows nothing about who said what, whereas everyone involved in the peer review process knows who the authors are. So immediately there's an intrinsic bias. If you get on with Professor X, you're more likely to get that paper published, or they may be more likely to have a favorable review. Whereas if there's conflict and you don't agree with people and you fight and you hate each other and this guy stole something from me, then there's going to be intrinsic head to head, and there's that element of bias that comes in. Some of my favorite journal processes are double-blinded processes where when I submit my work as an author, all of my details and where I've come from and where the project has gone gets deleted before it gets sent to a peer reviewer. So it's double-blinded, so no one knows anything about anyone. But that still follows the same pathway of sending it to an external reviewer. So these are the two common pathways. At anesthesia, we do try to keep things internally. At BJA, they do try and reach out to external peer reviewers, and that both have their strengths and weaknesses, I think. So we've got that paper. We decided if we're not going to accept it, we send it back to the author. Say, I'm really sorry, terribly sorry. Thank you for your time, but this is doesn't reach the priority that we would hope for our journal. If we decide to accept it, then it goes to the publisher. Okay, and the publisher then effectively takes the Word document and exports it as a PDF. They do a lot more, but that's a lot of what the publishers do is they help to present it. They should do a lot of the copy editing and the typesetting. Copy editing is doing the editing for style, and typesetting is how things are presented to make sure they fit within the journal bounds. But when you look at this pathway, when you look at this flow, to my personal perspective, again, as I said to you, these are all my opinions. My personal perspective is actually the peer review process is about these two key players, which is the author and the reader. Ultimately, what we need to do is we need to always focus on the authors and the readers, because the readers are the ones that are going to be implementing that science, and the authors are the ones that's going to be generating that knowledge. So our job, and we had an editorial board meeting on Friday with the journal, is to just continuously emphasize to everyone that our responsibilities are to the authors and to the readers, and that's really our primary responsibilities. Okay. So what are the problems and what are the expectations for peer review? Okay, so time. So it takes a huge amount of time for authors. It takes a huge amount of time for editorial teams. It takes a fair amount of time for external reviewers, but not as much, of course, as authors and then editorial teams. Some time for publishers and very little time for the readers to participate in the whole peer review process. Of course, as I said, research isn't done until it's communicated, and part of that communication is the reader. So one expects readers to spend some time reading that work. Okay, how much does it cost people? So it costs authors a lot. It costs them in time, it costs them in money usually, and that's why there's grants, right? Because you've got to get grants to be able to conduct the research, and that's really the problem. So it costs them time. The editorial team, it costs us a huge amount of time. Okay, people get small amounts of honoraria, but I spend, anywhere, depending on which journal, anywhere between 20 and 30 hours a week, sometimes, depending on what it is. So we're losing actually money because we're losing time. It costs the publisher something because they've got to get things typeset, printed, et cetera, et cetera. It costs the reader a lot because the reader has to have some form of subscription or some way of accessing this work, okay? And so it does cost the reader some time, but who makes the most out of all of this process? Who makes the most money out of all of this process? Well, clearly it's the publishers, right? They make a huge amount of money. In fact, publishing of scientific literature is one of the biggest money makers out there. It's absolutely brilliant. It's been going on for 350 odd years or so. The idea of it that actually gets all of these people, the authors, the editors, to do all of this work, and the publisher's job is purely to disseminate. And this is a big issue, and this is one problem that we're facing these days, which is the profitability of scientific publishing and who ends up paying for that profitability. And you can see here, these are just a couple of papers that have been recently published. One was about COVID-19, the bottom one there by Justin Fox, and I think that was in Bloomberg, and the top one is in The Guardian, which is actually a very strong proponent of open access publication. So there's the financial element of things, which, I mean, ultimately, to be honest with you, the editorial team have zero interest in. The editorial team, as I said, our focus is on the authors and the readers, and what we tried to do is we tried to work with our publishers and work with our institutions to try and make it as accessible to authors and readers as possible. So I think I'm going to get on to a little bit about publication models. So publication models is the next thing that I want to cover. Before I do, does anyone have any questions about how journals work? Anyone?
I might just ask a quick question. That's right. So you mentioned something that hadn't really occurred to me before, that there's some strategy involved from the institution, so whether that's the college or the association. Is that kind of information publicly available? So, you know, as authors, we can see how we align with the strategy that's out there.
Yeah, I mean, so there's institutional strategy, which is open and available, and there's journal strategy, which through Freedom of Information Act, you should be able to access details on journal strategy. But ultimately, from an institutional perspective, journal strategy must always align with what that institution's strategy is. Now, institutional strategy, for example, I'll just give you an example. One of the things that matters to the association is global health, right? And is the global element and trying to tackle and deal with inequity in healthcare globally, which is why the association has put a huge amount of investment into, for example, the Global Capnography Project. So this is something that matters to the association. This is one of the strategic aims of the association, is to make safe anesthetic and perioperative care accessible to everyone. So what that means is we need to be constantly thinking about making sure, A, that we take papers that contribute to that bigger picture, but also in our publication models, in our dissemination strategies, and our public engagement strategies, meet that. So we cannot just say, right, we are only going to be focusing on authors and readers in the UK. Actually, that's not in keeping with the association's model, and we need to be thinking, how do we engage authors abroad, or authors in the lower middle income countries? And you will see that we do publish a lot of work looking at low and middle income countries, because that's in keeping with the association's strategy. And similarly with the college, education is really, really important. And that's why, I mean, there is the whole BJA education. That staple is because education is one of the key strategic aims of the college, right? And given the report that's just come out a couple of days ago, that we really need to be expanding the workforce, you will see that there will be papers that are being taken because they support that strategic aim of the college. Does that make sense?
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Any other questions on how journals work and you know, the workflow? Cool. Okay, so I'll move on to publication models then. And I think this, it sounds like from the subtle responses that I was getting from Matt, that this is something that you guys were kind of interested in, or maybe you guys have discussed in the past, about open access versus not so open access, and what sort of journals to go for. So I talked about this flow, and remember, to get from the publisher to the reader, there's a paywall. For most journals that we're used to dealing with, right? There is a paywall. Now, we are really lucky in the UK, because our institutions generally pay, so UCL, for example, or NHS Athens, they pay publishers to get a selection of journals, get access to a selection of journals that their employees or their researchers or whatever may want. And that's kind of one of the reasons why impact factor matters, actually, because once your impact factor hits 5, then your institution is much more likely to pay the publisher for that journal. So that's where impact factor kind of to a certain extent comes in, but I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So there is this paywall, and there's several ways that a reader can access the work that the author has published. So you can either have a subscription, or pay the publisher. You've seen these. You pay $35 or whatever it is, 40 quid or whatever many euros it is for a paper, because you don't have access to it from any other way. Your institution can have a subscription to that journal or via that publisher, and then through the institution, you get access to that paper. There's, of course, other subscriptions that you can have. So, you could have, there's different types of subscription models out there that allow you to get access to published work. But remember, the publishers for non-open access journals and non-open access papers, they own the copyright. So you cannot just share it or send it around or whatever. It really sits with the publisher, and you're accessing it from the publisher. There are, of course, other means. Okay, so I get this not infrequently where a reader will email me from, say, South America and say, "Hey, mate, listen, I don't have access to your paper. Can you send me your paper if that's all right?" There's also other sources which aren't so kosher, like ResearchGate. Actually, publishers despise ResearchGate, and ResearchGate, in effect, actually, if PDFs are being shared on ResearchGate, that's actually illegal because the publishers own, unless the papers are open access, which I'll talk about now, the publishers own the copyright to that. So ResearchGate is actually not quite legal, and then there's, of course, services like Sci-Hub, which I'm sure one or two of you may be familiar with, and something's dodgy and illegal when there's a picture of the founder waving like that at you, a GIF of the founder waving at you constantly, right? That's dodge. But these are other ways that the reader can gain access to the paper. So you can see that this paywall is a problem, and this paywall is something that we argue about all the time. We had a massive argument with our publishers on Friday about it constantly. And that's what the editorial team's job is. My job is to get good science and give it to the readers so that it impacts on their clinical service, on their patients, on what they do in their day-to-day. There are other ways to do it. So go with open access. So in hybrid journal models, which is what most of the journals that we use, the author can pay to own the copyright to that paper, okay? And either the author pays or someone pays for them. So their institution. So I know, for example, KCL has signed a deal with Wiley. So any paper that I publish with Wiley as the publisher, KCL will pay the publisher the article processing charges. It's about £2,500. You can, of course, pay it yourself, which is preposterous to my mind, because you've done all of this hard work, and some money-making machine like the publisher is expecting you to pay them to convert your Word document with all of the hard work that you put into a PDF and print that. And now, of course, there's a marketing side and things like that. But when push comes to shove, they are doing that, and we're not going to be printing journals for very much longer. So it is going to be effectively a process of converting Word documents, typesetting, copy correcting, and marketing. I'm not sure about that model personally. I think that certainly for our journal, we try to do everything we can to support our authors getting work to the readers. So gold open access means you own the copyright, so you could do whatever you want with that paper, okay? No one can stop you. If it's a normal paper behind a paywall, you cannot do anything with that paper. You have to ask for permission from the publisher. Okay, so then there's bronze open access. Now, bronze open access is effectively where the editorial team negotiates with the publisher and says, right, these papers, you will maintain the copyright to these papers, but these papers will be readily available with no paywall. So what we do, for example, at Anaesthesia is we do free for a day, where we say, okay, so this paper by Matt is fantastic, and we're going to be tweeting about it tomorrow. And we want when we tweet it, we want people to be able to click it and download it. We don't want it behind a paywall. And then the publishers will say, okay, fine, we'll give you that for a day. That's fine. We, of course, have an agreement that any paper that's older than 12 months old should not have a paywall whatsoever. They should be free to access. There's free to access, which is bronze OA, and there's open access. Open access, the author or whoever's paid owns the copyright. Free to access is the publishers and the institutions still own the copyright, but you don't need to pay to read the paper. Okay, so we spend a lot of time with our publishers constantly negotiating ways that we can maximize bronze open access to our papers. The publishers hate that. If it was up to all medical publishers, everything would be behind a paywall, and all of us would be paying to publish our work and paying to read the work. But you know, different publishers take different extremes. So I'll give you an example about a publisher, is Elsevier. Now, Elsevier has repeatedly been seen as the most evil publisher out there. There's journals and papers and blogs that have talked about how evil Elsevier are, but actually, lots of publishers like BMJ or Wiley, for example, they negotiate deals. They negotiate deals with countries, with governments, with institutions, and they say, right, okay, we will give you reduced article processing charges, reduced article processing fees, to make all of the work that your authors, so for, you know, with the country, anyone from Italy, say, or anyone from Germany, anyone who publishes or does research from Germany, their work will be open access. So they negotiate these deals. Elsevier, for example, refused to negotiate these deals, and they said everyone has to pay full prices, no deals to be cut, which is why, interestingly, in the Netherlands, in Germany, and now in California, you are unable to access Elsevier journals because they negotiated these deals. They refused to negotiate these deals, and the countries and the institutions said, right, fine, our authors are not going to send their work to you, so we're not interested in any Elsevier journals, which has been really interesting because competitor journals who aren't published by Elsevier have all of a sudden in the last 2 years got a deluge of papers from Germany and from the Netherlands that would normally be published in, people would normally submit to Elsevier journals, but they're not submitting there anymore. So this is a little bit of the background about the publishers and how it works with the publishers. And listen, we partner with the publishers, we work with them, and they're really important for us to be able to actually do our jobs properly and well. But I think that the aims of the editorial team and the aims of the publishers are not always reflective of each other's aims. For me personally, and for us as an editorial team, my aims are the author and the reader, and of course, who that reader's clinical work affects, you know, all of their patients. That's my priority, right? Okay, so there are the traditional models. There are some journals which are purely open access, like BMJ, for example. But there are alternative models out there, okay? And so these are a couple of the alternative models. So I think I've talked about this, where the institution will pay for article processing fees. The authors can pay the article processing fees. Or there are, of course, models where there's a very light editorial process, which is what I would think as predatory journals. And this is really, really problematic. There are loads of them out there where they'll say, dearest Professor High Lord something or other, you send your work to us and you will get it published. And this actually is not uncommon. One of the best known, I still view them as predatory, as Hindawi publishers, because they actually don't do a huge amount of peer review. They are very, very light on their editorial work. They take from the authors quite a bit of article processing charges, and then they publish. And then, of course, it's open access to everyone. So effectively, all they do is, it's online publication. All they do is they convert it to a Word document and they present it and they typeset it. But there's very little in the way of scientific rigor and scientific integrity, because the peer review process is absolutely critical. It's one of the key things that the editorial teams do, is do thorough, meticulous peer review processes. So I would warn people to beware of these predatory journals and any journals that promise publication as long as these pay a couple of grand. You know, that's always troubling, and that it's quite disruptive to the industry. But then there's something else that is been going on for some time, and I was at the editors-in-chief meeting at the ASA last year. How I miss being in actual meetings. But I was at that meeting, and I know that anesthesiology, Evan Karash and ANA are adamant that they will not accept anything that's ever been anywhere near a preprint. In fact, they won't even put a reference to a preprint server. But this is an alternative model, so preprint. So this, you get rid of everything in between, and it goes from author to reader, okay? But you lose the whole idea of peer review. So, and this is, you know, been seen very recently with everything that's been happening with COVID, is so much of what we've learned and so much of what we've done has come from preprint, which is really good and also really bad, because the peer review process is absolutely critical, and there's been changes in practice without thorough peer review. So preprints have tremendous strength, but they should always come with a proviso. And this is the third publication model, I think, that increasingly people are recognizing. So I've talked about how journals work and publication models. Any questions on either of those two now, before I move on to our third and final bit, and then some questions? Everyone happy with publication models? Good. Okay, so then is choosing the right journal. Okay, so this is actually a lot of thought needs to go into this. I've discussed this with several people in the past, some people that are actually watching here today. And there's lots of reasons to choose a particular journal to send your work to, okay? Some of them are impact factor, Altmetrics, specialty, similarity, similar papers, author services. The commonest one is impact factor, okay? So I'm sure you all know this, but just to highlight, the impact factor, for example, 2019, which is what we're currently operating on, looks at the citations of papers published in 2017 and 2018 in 2019, divided by the total citable items in those 2 years, okay? So let's say you published 5 citable papers and in 2017 and 2018, and in 2019, you had a total of 5 citations. Your impact factor would therefore be 1, okay? The way to really think about impact factor as well, which a lot of people don't realize, is your own work. So if you publish a paper in a journal with an impact factor of 5, and it gets 10 citations in the subsequent 2 years, then you I don't know if you've undersold yourself, but you've done a service to that journal, because you've raised that journal's impact factor to a certain extent, because the mean number of citations was 5, and you got 10 in those 2 years. So actually, you will have supported bringing up the impact factor of that journal. People don't necessarily think about that, but actually it matters. So this is one way that you can choose what journal to go to is impact factor, and people usually go from top to bottom. There's strengths and weaknesses to it, okay? So it is sustainable, and it's been used for years and years and years and years and years, okay? So people have used impact factors for a long, 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 long time. It's fragile, okay? So I'll give examples. I like this gift, but I'll give an example. A journal who I won't name, in 2015, I think it was, published some guidelines on difficult airway management. It was a subspecialty journal, and their impact factor went from 1, went up and up and up in the subsequent 2-3 years, to about 3.5 or something like that. So they were doing fantastic. But remember, it's only those 2 years, 2017, 2018, or whatever it is, that matter. So once that has elapsed, it doesn't matter how many times it gets published. The paper could be gets cited. It could be cited 8 trillion gazillion times. It doesn't matter. That does not affect your impact factor. It's only those 2 years. So that highly cited paper that they had dropped off. And suddenly they went back from 3.4 or 3.5, I think it was, down to 1 point something or other. So it can be quite fragile to journals who are working on just their 2-year impact factor. A 5-year impact factor is a lot less fragile, but most journals are not interested in 5-year impact factors because no one has that attention span. But it is fragile. It's easy to game. Okay, so impact factors. This is a problem with impact factor is journals game impact factors all the time, and you will see this. A competitor journal that we all probably know, not in the UK, for example, they take the view, so the denominator matters. Citable items 2017, 2018 matters, okay? So how do you increase the impact factor? Well, what you could do is you could be uber, super, duper, duper, duper selective about what you publish. And a journal that we all kind of know probably publishes about 3-4 papers a month. So they try to maintain their impact factor by being super duper selective. And they do it by publishing things like guidelines, which everyone cites. Guidelines are readily citable. So that's why guidelines, people are constantly saying, we want more guidelines, we want more guidelines. So it is relatively easy to game. There's been there's one case recently of a journal whose impact factor has gone up and up and up, and they will probably be suspended in the next year or so because their editor-in-chief has been gaming the system by publishing letters in lots of different other journals and citing their own journal. So they've been trying, the journal themselves have been trying to game, which is when you come unstuck. Impact factor matters to researchers, it matters to funders, as we talked about. But does it matter to readers? I mean, ultimately, if you go to the anesthetics department of any hospital and the people who aren't necessarily involved in research, you ask them, what's the impact factor of any journal? They probably won't really know, and they probably won't really care. But if you tell them which journal you prefer reading, they will be able to tell you, and it has nothing to do with impact factor. It has to do with content. Okay, so impact factor matters to researchers and matters to funders. It matters to the journals and institutions, etc. But it might not matter to the end user necessarily. Another way of choosing what journal you want to publish your work in is how the journal supports and raises something like Altmetrics scores. Okay, so this is social media engagement, which includes things like news and blogs and tweets and Facebook, and how many times your paper been saved on Mendeley, which actually is owned by Elsevier, which I recognize as problematic because they are the evil multinational conglomerate monsters that are trying to steal everything from us. But anyways, what Altmetrics I think is really important about is it's not just about the researcher, okay? This is who's reading, who's talking about things. People on Facebook and Twitter and things, they're not necessarily doing the research. What they're doing is they are consuming, so they are the reader, they're at the end there, and they are engaging with that work. And of course, things like news. So news matters because, again, that does not affect who does further research on something. That affects what the patients think and what the end user thinks, right? So I don't know how sustainable it is. It is also quite fragile, you know, and it can be a little bit hit and miss sometimes. It is much more difficult to game. And like I said, it matters to readers, and I don't know how much it matters to funders necessarily yet, but I think this is going to be somewhere that we're going to need to be thinking about is that citations matters to researchers, which is impact factor. Altmetrics and social media reach matters to readers and clinicians. And I think with time, we're going to need to be thinking about these sorts of metrics. Okay, how else can we choose what journal to submit to? So we could think of a specialty journal. So your work, you may think BMJ or Lancet or JAMA or New England Journal, a general medical journal, okay, is a good fit for your work. It really, the type of work that you do matters. So that you really need to think about, is the general readership going to care about this work that I'm doing? Are they really going to care about 5 mils versus 8 mils for an interscalene brachial plexus block using 0.375% ropivacaine with or without adrenaline? I mean, you got to think about who might be interested. You think about the reader. Everything always comes back to the author and the reader. Think about the reader. Do you want it to be into a specialty journal? Now, of course, specialty journals in general have higher impact factors and are more likely to get better altmetric scores than subspecialty journals. But if this is something, for example, about obstetrics, well, you can always think, actually, this might go into IJOA a little bit better than a general journal, than a specialty journal like Anesthesia or BJA or Anesthesiology. It's cardiovascular, so it might be better in the thing. Peri-operative medicine is a subspecialty journal. So you got to think about who their readership will, which readership this will matter to. And then another thing that you got to think about is similarities, okay? So the topic of interest, is this, what journals have published work with similar topics of interest in the past? Because you do that, you find the journals, that means the editorial team have some form of interest in this work. That means the readership have some form of interest in this work. And so therefore, that might be a good home for the work that you're doing. So find a journal that has published similar papers in the past, or that has a topic of interest, for example. And then finally, and I think this really matters, is author services, okay? So the peer review process. So, I make no qualms in admitting that the peer review process of the CJA, for example, is phenomenal. I love the CJA. They always get really insightful reviewers. And I found that any paper that I published there, it really is better after the peer review process. So the peer review process matters. Author support and accessibility. I mean, being able to just email your editor, being able to just speak to them, being able to just contact them. You know, what I do sometimes with anesthesia is I'll sometimes email them directly and say, hey, listen, maybe we could talk about this. And I'll pick up the phone sometimes and I'll call the authors. I'm handling the paper, but sometimes it is just much easier to just pick up the phone and speak to someone, okay? Because end of the day, what you want is the journal to make your work better. And there sometimes just picking up the phone and talking to someone really, it makes a difference. You break those barriers, you break those boundaries, and it's important to realize that actually all of these big barriers and things like that are, I don't know how important they are in necessarily improving the quality of your work. So author support and accessibility is really, really important. This is actually one of the reasons why it took us as a journal so long to go to editorial manager. We were doing email until 2 years ago. So you would submit your work via email. And it's not that we couldn't afford or we didn't, we were old fashioned. It's that, let's be honest, you drop an email you submit your work by email, and it is just so easy. It was just so easy, and authors loved being able to just email our editorial coordinator, say, hey, submitting this paper here, and that's done. Of course, there's problems with audit trails, and there's problems with papers getting lost, and email, let's be honest, sucks right now. I mean, it's just broken. It's just full of noise constantly. So we have to move across to a platform like Editorial Manager. but the accessibility matters. The other thing is press releases, okay, and social media promotion. So journals often compete with for big guidelines and things like that, and you bid for them. So you'll say, right, okay, the whatever, the Puma guidelines, the airway guidelines that are coming out, we want them. So you speak to the authors before you know that they're happening, and you speak to them and say, hey, how can we convince you to submit your work to us? And things like press releases. So journals that do frequent press releases, which we do. I mean, in the last 4 to 6 months, we've done 11 press releases with anesthesia. Sometimes they come off, sometimes they don't, but that's okay. What we're trying to do is we're trying to showcase and support and disseminate as much as possible the important work that our authors have submitted to us, right? So social media and promotion is important because, again, it goes beyond just this concept of impact factors, and it goes to reaching out to individual authors everywhere. So that matters. And of course, speed. I mean, there's some journals that are just painfully slow, and I just cannot think of submitting my work there. There's one that is quite well known to all of us that actually I had a paper accepted, and it took 19 months. It was a systematic review, so it was well out of date by the time it got published. 19 months to get it published. Utterly preposterous. Of course, I haven't sent anything back to that journal, but speed matters, okay? Because in this day and age, you really don't want to be sat on your paper for 6, 8, 10 months. Okay, you want to keep moving. You want the work to be out. You want the impact to get there. You want to move on to the next thing. You want the work that you've done to change practice, and it only changes practice once it's out. Dissemination matters, and so this is another thing that actually in your decision making on which journal to go for, you need to weigh up. So impact factor matters, Altmetrics matters, specialties matter, similarities of the work that you've done matters, and author services matter. Do not base everything on just one of these facets or one of these elements of individual journals. Okay, think of the package, think of the picture. All journals work to improve their impact factor, but is that journal working to improve the Altmetrics and the reach of your paper? Is that journal working to to raise the profile of the work that you're doing and improve clinical practice? So I hope what I've done is I've covered these 3 key things, and I'm happy to sit back and take some questions. Again, as I said, everything was my opinion. What I want to leave you with is the social media editor for the journal has refined and revised this phrase, which is content is king, dissemination is queen, and timing is everything. And that's from Mike Charlesworth. And I think that's absolutely crucial. You know, the content is king. The work that you do as a researcher is what really, really matters. But so does the dissemination, because research is not done until it is communicated. And timing is everything. If I've done a fantastic piece of work on COVID-19 and it gets published in 2023, it's irrelevant. Even if the content is great and the dissemination is great, timing is everything. So thank you very much for listening to me. I hope that was somewhat useful, and it was kind of what you guys wanted to hear.